Imagine, if you will, a young boy sitting by his mother's hearth, gazing dreamily at the fire, over which is an iron kettle filled with water. And as the water begins to boil, steam is generated, jostling the lid slightly. And again, and then still more violently. And then all of a sudden, the young boy sits bolt upright, crying out, "Eureka! I will build a device which can harness the power of steam to perform useful work." And that young boy grew up to become James Watt, the famous inventor of the steam engine. Watt was merely one of dozens of towering individual geniuses. This was the great Industrial Revolution, and it changed the world forever, enriching innovators and entrepreneurs, raising standards of living throughout society, and profoundly changing the way people lived their lives on a daily basis. Or did it? Is this view of the Industrial Revolution as the product of daring individual geniuses, which improved the lives of everybody throughout global societies, accurate? Or is the Industrial Revolution just BS? Let's talk about it. Hi, I'm Dr. Doug Campbell. The so-called Industrial Revolution began in Great Britain in the 1760s and gradually spread from there over the course of the next 100+ years throughout the entire planet. And from the get-go, we're not here to talk about whether this was important or not. There is no serious dispute that this was profoundly significant. The question is more, how did it happen and what were its effects? And we're going to discuss this in 4 basic realms: technology, capital, labor, and power. And the technology stuff we have sort of already referenced with what we could term the classic view of the Industrial Revolution that kind of focuses on individual inventors and inventions. The steam engine is sort of the archetypical Industrial Revolution invention, using coal fires to heat water to produce steam, which then drives pistons, which you can do all sorts of cool stuff with. But it is far from the only famous invention. Certainly we could mention Hargreaves' spinning jenny, Arkwright's water frame, Samuel Crompton's spinning mule, which, by the way, all of those are involved in cotton textiles. That's hardly accidental. The cotton textiles industry was certainly the first proper kind of Industrial Revolution industry as such, but we could also reference Stephenson's steam-powered locomotives, Fulton's steamship, the communications innovations, Morse's telegraph, Bell's telephone, all of that stuff. And the standard narrative of the Industrial Revolution tends to focus on those individual geniuses, which obviously there is something to that. All of those devices were super important, and those people were undeniably brilliant. On a personal level, as somebody of predominantly Scottish descent, I would love to make the claim that a Scotsman like James Watt was sort of single-handedly responsible for transforming the course of human history and improving everybody's lives and sort of demonstrating that the Scots are the single awesomest people on the face of the earth.
Doesn't it make you proud to be Scottish?
It's shite being Scottish! We're the lowest of the low! The scum of the fucking earth! The most wretched, miserable, servile, pathetic trash that was ever shot into civilization! Some people hate the English, I don't! They're just wankers! We, on the other hand, are colonised by wankers! Can't even find a decent culture to be colonised by!
That said, though, a lot of this emphasis is a little bit overblown. Significantly, most of these inventions do not sort of come out of thin air, but rather represent the culmination of generations of tinkering and modifying and taking previous people's ideas and putting a slightly new spin on it that works a little bit better, a little bit more efficiently. Certainly if we just want to take Watt's steam engine, he's not the first one to do that. He's not the first one to have that idea. You can trace the roots of the idea of the steam engine back to 1st century Rome and a philosopher named Hero of Alexandria who came up with the idea of a steam engine, even if he didn't come up with a working model. In the early 1700s, Thomas Newcomen came up with a version of the steam engine that kind of sort of worked. And Watt came along and took that design and modified it to make it slightly more efficient in such a way that you could miniaturize it, do more stuff with it, it became more profitable, and most of the Industrial Revolution inventions are kind of like that. It's not really the result of isolated individual geniuses. Clearly, you can't have an Industrial Revolution without the cool machines.
Where does it get those wonderful toys?
That said, we've got to locate this in something of a system, too. The technology, like plenty of societies, have had all sorts of cool technological innovations. But the scope of the adoption of the new technologies was one of the things that made the Industrial Revolution novel. And in part, it is because it fits into the matrix of a new economic system that had taken hold in Britain, which, why don't we call it capitalism? The old medieval feudal system had gradually been breaking down, and by the late 1600s, something new had taken its place. The institution of private property became increasingly well established. In the arena of land ownership, the process of enclosure, of sort of fencing off agricultural fields, supplanted the old fields farmed in common by rural communities. Rather than doing this collaboratively, you now had landowners in the countryside, some of whom had access to the better farmland and some of who did not. You had a rising class of ambitious entrepreneurial farmers who are interested in producing a variety of commodities that they could make a profit off of. You also had a new system of wage labor, which was increasingly supplanting the old institutions of medieval serfdom, which was essentially a form of tenant farming, where the tenant who rented the land was obligated to donate labor to the landowner. Instead, you had laborers who were now selling their labor for a wage. Obviously, for this, you need a well-established monetary system. You got to have a system of currency. You also have to have a system of credit to lend to people who are seeking to get involved in businesses or entrepreneurship. Vitally, too, and this is often overlooked, a lot of this development developed in tandem with Britain's overseas colonial holdings, which enabled Britain to kind of plunder the New World and leach wealth in the form of various agricultural commodities. There is no industrial revolution without the Atlantic system, which is based on land seizures in the Americas and the use of African slave labor. That is a necessary precondition to everything that happens in the Industrial Revolution, up to and including all of the cotton that is going to be woven into cotton textiles in all of those mills in Birmingham and Manchester and Liverpool and London. Other previous economic systems featured the upper classes accumulating wealth with an eye towards just simply reproducing the system in as stable a form as possible. Capitalism was not like that. Among other things, I mean, even its critics, I think, would have to admit that capitalism is the single most dynamic and explosively productive economic mode that the human species has yet devised. Part of the reason for that is the capitalist mode of production does not merely accumulate wealth, does not sort of hoard capital, but rather reinvests it. The idea is for an individual entrepreneur to make a profit, not sit on that profit, but rather reinvest the profit in the business in order to produce more capital, more profit. Which then in turn will be reinvested in this kind of cycle of capital. Cash rules everything around me. Green, get the money. Dollar bill, yo. Is what produces the tremendously dynamic growth that is so characteristic of capitalism. Also comes at the price, obviously, of periodic crises. It's a very unstable system. It's a very socially disruptive system, but it's certainly incredibly dynamic and produces growth and wealth, at least for certain sectors. Can't do any of that, though, without labor. We've already mentioned there is a transition here to a new wage labor force, that there are a lot of people who are driven off of the countryside where they had previously labored as agricultural workers, as farmers essentially, into the new factories. Likewise, there is the gradual transformation of the old sort of handicrafts, that the previous model of labor had been cottage industry by skilled laborers. That essentially, if you want to produce something, you've got somebody who has learned that skill, often as a formal apprentice of a master who knows that skill, maybe affiliated with a guild, as was the case during the Middle Ages. And that form of production, you start with the raw materials for whatever it is you're producing, and that one skilled artisan participates in every step of the production process, from the raw materials to the finished product. Obviously, industrial labor is different. Since it is tied to machines, this totally transforms labor, that you see a shift from skilled cottage industry to unskilled laborers in factories, that you put all production under one roof. Often you have to, because these machines are complex, these machines are expensive. Workers in these factories, according to the British lingo, were referred to as hands or as operatives, because that's what they did. That they were responsible for operating a machine, one step in the production process, sort of over and over and over again. We should mention too, obviously, this is before any sort of workplace safety laws or anything like that. There are no limits on working hours. So conditions in the factories were dark, dirty, and dangerous. There were a lot of injuries from operating unsafe machines. In textiles, there's all sorts of toxic chemical dyes. People are stuck in a stuffy room inhaling cotton fibers. That leads to lung ailments. And people are working pretty grotesque hours. It is certainly not unheard of for people to be working 12, 14, 16-hour days with very minimal breaks. And not just men, but women and children who can perform exactly the same tasks as men in the factories, but according to the social standards, the owners can get away with paying them less. So this represents an intensification of labor, that workers were working much harder, much more consistently too. You had to work at the pace of the machine rather than at your own pace. So the actual conditions under which your average industrial laborer worked were significantly worse than what you saw with, say, a medieval peasant or certainly a medieval skilled craftsman. And again, no longer their own boss as well. One of the interesting things about the Industrial Revolution, and what I meant when I said it transforms the way that people live, is there is a revolution in time. Before the advent of industrial modernity, people tended not to know what time it was. Obviously, they knew in the sense of, it's morning, it's noon, it's evening, it's dark out, so it must be night, right? But nobody knew the exact time down to the minute. Because nobody needed to. It was irrelevant to how people lived their daily lives. But all of a sudden during the Industrial Revolution, you had to know, because the owners had to get all of their employees at the factories at the same time. Not too late, not too early, because they worked in tandem with this industrial production process. And for that to be the case, they had to know what time it was. So, it is no accident that you see a proliferation of clock towers throughout Britain during the 19th century, because you had to have a means for the working class to know what time it was so they could be at work on time, so the owners wouldn't get mad at them and beat them or dock their pay. And that is absolutely the sort of stuff that happened. And so finally, let's talk about power. First of all, one sort of power we need to reference is simply the power that drove the machines. The earliest machines were often tied to human muscle power, but there are inherent limitations in that. By the early 1800s, there was definitely a move towards more robust sources of power. And ultimately, the contest boiled down to, was it going to be water power, water wheels driven by water from rivers, or was the source of power going to be coal-fired steam engines? And again, the classic narrative of the Industrial Revolution argues that coal-fired steam engines won out because they were more efficient and they were cheaper, and this is kind of a free market system, so that's the sort of solution that's always going to win. Here, though, we could reference a recent book by a scholar named Andreas Malm. His book, Fossil Capital, analyzes precisely this set of issues, and after crunching the data, he finds that, actually, from the perspective of the 1820s and 1830s, water power was just as, if not more efficient than steam power. And it was cheaper to boot. And yet coal-fired steam power won out. Why was that? According to Malm, it's essentially because there were other advantages besides efficiency and cost that coal and steam had going for them. In particular, it allowed more control over labor. That Malm found that if you're going to use a water wheel, what you've got to do is locate your factory near a river system somewhere that there's a change in elevation. There you can put the water wheel and power your machines. That tended to be out in rural areas away from the urban centers. That meant that labor was at a premium, and that also meant that if there was a dispute between labor and the ownership, that labor had a certain advantage. Whereas coal-fired steam engines, you could put in the urban centers where there's lots of unskilled labor to choose from, and there the owners have the advantage. So, may have been more expensive, but coal-fired steam engines allowed for more control over the workers. And finally, too, water power, like the watercourses themselves, were free, and you would think that would be an advantage, but the fact that coal was a commodity that could be sold at a profit, that was a perk for the owners of these factories. Likewise, too, water necessitated cooperation and sharing of this sort of free natural resource, whereas coal-fired steam engines could be much more individually controlled. So even though it was less efficient and for a while at least more expensive, coal fit better with the ethos of industrial capitalism. Coal remains the single most widely used fossil fuel. It powers all of our lives in the modern world, even as it puts society at catastrophic risk from the warming effects of carbon dioxide emissions. So that's the dilemma with coal. It has powered the transformation of our society, but at the same time, it seems to be killing us. We also ought to reference power in another sense, too, though. Not merely the motive power of fossil fuels, but also the power of the state, the power of government. And here, too, we've got to again combat some of the classic narrative that held that the entrepreneurs who were involved in the Industrial Revolution were adamantly against any government interference in economic markets. That was, in fact, not really the case. Obviously, on a certain level, capitalists wanted government out of certain aspects of the economy. They didn't want it messing with market mechanisms for setting prices for commodities. They didn't want the government taxing wealth, but certainly they wanted the government's power to do certain things. They wanted it to protect the institution of private property. They wanted it to guarantee contracts. They wanted it to maintain the colonies abroad, which, as we've noted, were pretty vital to at least getting the Industrial Revolution off the ground. And certainly they wanted the government to ensure that labor did not organize and use the strength of numbers against this new system. So the use of government power against the labor movement was very characteristic of the Industrial Revolution. And the factory owners used their new economic clout to get the state to crack down on any labor activism. You can see this with the Peterloo Massacre of 1819, or the general strike that was broken up by the British military in 1842. It's very characteristic of industrial capitalism to use the power of the state on behalf of the capitalist system against the workers. Recommended readings for a good summation of what I've been terming the classic view of the Industrial Revolution as a largely benign process that improves everybody's lives and which is driven by the inventions of great individual geniuses. T.S. Ashton's The Industrial Revolution, 1760 to 1830, is well written, it's short, and gives you a good encapsulation of that. For a description of working class life and what this did to the workers, there is perhaps no better source than Friedrich Engels' The Condition of the Working Class in England from 1845. Certainly you could also check out the magisterial work by E.P. Thompson, The Making of the English Working Class. which does a great job of describing the advent of a working class identity in Britain. And finally, we've already mentioned the more recent book by Andreas Malm, Fossil Capital, The Rise of Steam Power and the Roots of Global Warming from 2016. So ultimately, our verdict here, the Industrial Revolution certainly was important, but if we are going to portray it solely as a positive set of developments that changed everybody's lives for the better as a result of all of these great individual geniuses laboring in isolation, that is very much BS. The Industrial Revolution has certainly created the world in which we live today, but if we do not get a handle on some of the problems that have come along with it, the exploitation of workers, the profoundly unequal distribution of wealth, the out-of-control use of fossil fuels, which are putting our very society at jeopardy, we're going to find ourselves in a lot of trouble. That's all for now. See you later. Bye.